Indians have a lot pinned on the upcoming budget as it's the last budget before the elections in 2024. Will the finance minister present a blue sky vision or will it be a non-event? Let's discuss this then with Ronnie Screwvala, co-founder and chairperson of upGrad, right here in his office. Hi, Mr. Screwvala. Thanks for having me. So I wanted to start off by talking about the budget as a whole because there's a lot of hopes being pinned. Is it going to be a blue sky vision painted by the finance minister, or do you think it'll be a bit of a non-event?
Well, I think firstly, budgets are an event and they're a non-event. And I think we should be ready for that. Now, we're 75 years old as a country and as a republic. And I think a budget is a summation of a year's progress of the past and a year's planning of the future. To then squeeze in 19 other deliberations that happen through the year is a bit of a tough one. So that's my sense of a broad expectation. Second, I think it's become an awful place where most people have thought this is the right place only to talk about the stock market or taxation. What's the tax there? And I think that's flawed. That's really flawed because I think budgets are not meant and benchmarked for that kind of an approach. So these are my two broad. If I had a thesis, and I think from a finance minister's point of view, and we have a very mature, very balanced, very down-to-earth finance minister. There are four broad themes for me, not for this budget, but as an ongoing one. Number one, the poor have got poorer, maybe a little bit thanks to COVID, but to a certain extent, not just in India, but around the world. So there's no question of saying, will it be a populist budget or not? You cannot be the third largest going to the second largest economy in the world unless you actually tend for the poor. So it can't be viewed as populist. The poor are getting poorer and we need to have at least 25% allocation to how that people are going to feel that sense of aspiration in the country. I think the second one, if I were to broadly, unless you want to ask me a different question. No, I think the second part for me is really the element of skilling and jobs. Because I think in India, that's a massive challenge. We can talk about GST, we can talk about taxation, but at the core of it, we need to be a much more higher skilled nation than we are today. And there's a lot that needs to be done there. For us to be job enabled, forget about the fact that where will the next 200 million jobs come. So that whole ecosystem, and I think a budget can be a great turbo booster. And I think the last two budgets, the focus on education, the focus on skilling has been very much part of the budget. So I see this as a very important continuum where India has to be a much more higher skilled nation for intellectual property and for thinking, not just masonry and carpentry. That will lead to the 200 million jobs. Connected with that is, yes, Startup India, which was a massive campaign that the Prime Minister evangelized. And I think if you connect the dots there, 100 million of the next 200 million jobs are going to be created because of startups. And not unicorns, unfortunately. We should take that out of the spectrum because they actually go up and then they fall as sharply as they go up. So I would just take the unicorns off the table. It's a chest thumping moment for 9 investors and 4 founders. But really, the Startup India is not the ones you read in the media. They're the people behind the scenes. They're creating and changing lives and jobs. And they will create that. Third, I think, is the world. India now, if they want to be a third largest player, we have to be insulated to a certain extent, and yet global capital has to be attracted. For that, business and ease of doing business in this country still needs to get to the next level. And I think a budget's job is to keep disentangling the webs to attract global capital of a great nature. I'm very happy with the FDI that's come in, but Vietnam today is getting almost as much FDI as India is. Why? Because they've positioned themselves as the next China for outsourcing. India has got incredible amount of scope, but we need that positioning management.
You said the word turbo booster, and forgive me, we're a business news channel, so I have to get back to taxes and ask you that one question. I will come to jobs, etc. But because there's a lot of buzz, as always, before the budget, that is there going to be any tinkering with taxes and capital gains, etc. Is it just the budget banter, or do you think something incremental could happen?
See, I think we're a very efficient tax-paying country. If you look at UK and the Western world, they're paying much higher taxes than we are. It's a much more simple structure, and I think anyone wanting to live in India, and especially to contribute to the challenges of these 600 non-privileged people, I think we have a very balanced structure. Yeah, sure. Can capital gains between private and public get long-term and short-term? Those are things that will have to be fine-tuned as you go forward.
Okay.
Is a GST standardization always more simpler for adjudication and for this thing? Yes. Is that going to change whether we'll be the top 3 largest nations in the world in the $10 trillion economy faster? No, I don't think so. That's how I view taxation. It's the firecrackers in the midst of the noise. Stock markets don't determine the real pulse of the nation.
Yeah.
They do not. Unfortunately or fortunately, and thankfully, fortunately, they don't. But the hype that follows that
I'm going to headline that line.
No, but seriously, because actually what happens then is most people think the thumbs up or thumbs down on a budget. You go out there in rural India, you go out there in half of the places there, you think they give a damn about whether the stock market went up or not? No, but if they got their quota of anything they want to do, from a water scheme to houses and homes, 99% of the people are moving and thinking the budget is a thumbs up because of that. But unfortunately, we follow the tail, and the tail never wags the dog.
So maybe we'll proceed and chat a lot more about the budget. And thank you. So, I just want to take it to, a comment that was made by N. Chandrasekaran of the Tata Group, and he said that as of now, we're seeing a revolution in India. There's a change of attitude, and that India is poised to take leadership for resilience that is needed in the world. Would you concur with that?
I would definitely concur with that. Partly because I think Chandra always makes a lot of sense and he talks down to earth. So that's one reason I would confer. But I think it is true. Aspiration levels, ambition levels in a country like India, the national pride has gone through the roof over the last 5 to 10 years. And I think for good reason.
Right.
For good reason. And when you take that and you encapsulate that, the spirit is always much more the force behind anything that makes changes. You can make any policy change matters, but when you don't have the actual spirit and the people behind it, and I think the comment he's made is very clear, once you're with it and the people are with it, nothing can stop it.
Yeah, and I'm going to refrain from using the word funding winter, because I know you said that it's not for the startup community, it's not for the private equity community, but it's for the weather gods. So, but one can't ignore the fact that we have seen a spate of layoffs within the startup world, that a lot of companies have had to shut shop. There's the global recession as well. Are you worried at all?
No, I think that's the best thing that's happened in the last 2 years. In the last 3 years, the best thing has happened in the last 6 months.
Why?
And because of when people say, oh, but this is the worrisome time, I'm saying the worrisome time was 2 years back, when people were raising money with zero cost of capital, okay, and were actually chest-thumping moments of raising money, not building businesses. So I think the last 6 months is fantastic for India, fantastic for entrepreneurs, fantastic for founders, fantastic for building businesses. Yes, there is some collateral damage in the fact that a transient labor force has moved out, but actually there's an incredible amount of jobs on the other side. Thank God these people, otherwise they would have suffered in those organizations because they were badly planned. There were too many people doing the same job. They never had a vision for it. And I'm sure these people will they're young and they'll find more jobs. And I'm not trying to belittle that. But it's incredible what has happened. Absolutely incredible.
So you're saying that could be attributed to just, companies that were crazily, funded without any, actual path to profitability, and that it was a select few companies and that there is no
it is a select few companies and a select few 7 or 8 investors. Between the combination of them, they should take that responsibility. Of course, they'll never admit it. And they should just move out of the system or regurgitate or reinvent themselves. But the damage that they've done to the goodwill of actually people who want to build businesses to last is unfair and disproportionate.
Okay. Now let's move to jobs, because as a population, we're on the brink of overtaking China. Do you think that the budget can come out with some sort of a revolutionizing move for the jobs market?
Yes, I think it can. And I think a budget is a great place to start. Yeah. A budget place is an announcement. It's a promulgation. And I think to that extent, yes, absolutely. Because if we put the right focus on the fact that people have to be a lot more job ready than they have, I think everyone needs to move 2 levels up in their generalization, in their specialization, in their skill sets, in their mental approach, in the way they want to do that. The reason why in the last 10 years most people say when I take people from graduates and they're not unemployable and then they send them a 3 months training, that doesn't happen in the normal world. So just that benchmark, if the budget can articulate how important that is for job creation, and the government doesn't need to allocate all the budgets because private sector is there and waiting for it to happen, but it needs to be an enabler.
Okay. Lots more to talk about, Mr. Screwvala, but I believe you have a lovely terrace, so maybe we'll go explore and continue our discussion.
We'll have sunshine while we talk.
Lovely. So, Mr. Screwvala, you were talking about the pulse of India and the aspiration. You're very closely linked to that sphere of India as well with your non-for-profit. So, how do you think the budget can really help to improve the aspiration of rural India?
I think rural India is very important. I do want to pause and say one thing. We have to focus a little bit on urbanization also.
Right.
Our top 100 cities need to be much better in infrastructure, and I think the budget, the government and everyone, state and central, would be good to actually focus on that, because unlike China, where they actually develop the cities and 200 million people move from rural to here, because rural life is not so aspirational, there's a high level of migration. Because there's a high level of migration, urban cities are crumbling. So it's actually a double whammy for India, and we need to fix it on both sides. We need enough for rural India to stay in rural India. When I meet the people there, they are very powerfully strong about their roots. They want to stay there, but they're just feeling unable to not stay there, and then the aspiration of the city. So I think the budget can constantly see to it that the poorest of the poor need their daily concept of livelihood and their infrastructure, but enough not for them to totally migrate. And I think somewhere down the line, the migration is an element of how rural and urban joins up.
Yes, and you know, away from that, infrastructure is also very critical when it comes to the budget. Bold steps are needed on this front. Do you think that we will see that?
Well, you need bold steps, but you also need a lot of equity and a lot of money to do that. I think Mumbai is going through a transformational stage right now between the coastal road, between the metros. The Prime Minister came just a week back and inaugurated 30,000 to 40,000 crores worth of projects. So, and Delhi is going through the same. Bangalore actually needs a lot more, but doesn't do that. But there are so many other cities, right? Because Pune and Nagpur and Nashik, and I'm just saying, smaller places like Vijayawada and Guntur, those are the places where actually more aspiration, more startup will mushroom in smaller cities than in bigger cities. So I think allocations need to be done. Unfortunately, the government will always balance that. And there, I think the powerful tool, which unfortunately maybe we don't use to that extent, is privatization. And that would be my last point from the budget point of view in terms of importance and salience is, I think we kind of take one step forward and then tiptoe around privatization. The government can and could decide what they should not be in the business of, right? And I think no harm done by privatization of the airline and Air India, for example. If you take that symbolically in bank, in insurance, the amount of infrastructure and properties the government owns, if we can just liquidate 30% of what they've got there, you can actually uplift 600 million people from any level of poverty. So I'm not sure what's stopping us from doing that, and I'm not in the government, so I never want to criticize from the outside because I know exactly how challenge is there. But privatization in the budget can be a massive booster with a real every year plan on it.
You know, you spoke of startups mushrooming in tier 2 and 3 cities. And for the space as a whole, what do you think is the urgent need of the hour in order to attract more capital, say ease of doing business, and just make the sector more financially viable? Yeah,
I think, you see, I'm a strong proponent for a lot of people in startups who think that capital is the first point, the second point, and the third point of success. And it's actually not. It's normally the third point of it. So I think if you unleash the fact that we have an incredible market, a massive demand, we're a price-sensitive country, but we're a country with a lot in terms of demand. So the ability for startup to actually identify how they want to get in, not look at capital being the end all, because the evil with capital is the minute you have it, you try to spend it to get more capital. So I think if just that part of the startup ecosystem can be a little bit more frugal, more impactful, more price-sensitive, businesses will formulate and go to the next level.
Okay. But when it comes to steps that the government has taken, like ONDC, for example, I just want to understand, it has, you know, transformed really the offline market space and online market space. Do you think more steps in that vein need to be taken?
Yes, I think it all helps. And even though the government platforms may not be the best and the most exemplary, the very fact that they've actually shown the way is very, very strong, because it actually gets competition riled up, because there you'll get the mass people following it in the first place. And look, there are many people who want to join, 25% of the people want to join the government. So our entire workforce, we're talking about job employment, but government is the largest employer. right? And that, whether it's in railways or the police force or the army or multiple other elements of the IAS and whatever else, that entire environment, they need their platforms because the government is the largest employer in the country.
I want to ask, where have we gone wrong when it comes to some of the new age tech companies that have listed, just purely because of the way we've seen, shareholders, erode a lot of their wealth post the listing? Probably we have a long way to go, but what would be your take or your assessment on how things have panned out, particularly for new age tech?
Yeah, I think it's been a little unfortunate here, and I wouldn't put any blame specifically, but definitely the first blame, I think, is on the investors. Because when you take those private companies and you've taken the value at such unsubstantiable levels, you have to list above that. And that's not the real value, right? Because 5 private equity investors will value a company at X, but the million people in the public will value it at what they want to value it at. And there is no mismatch. And then you've got them pushing a founder that says, go list your company above my valuation. Because if they don't list above the valuation, they'll have a liquidation preference and they'll be a 0% holder. So I think everyone got caught in that quagmire of artificially pumped up valuations that cannot substantiate themselves in the public market. So that's the first flaw. I think the second is founders need to understand that getting independent board members is very important when you want to run a public listed company, because you need people whose agenda is only what the company is. Investors will come in. Most of the time their agenda is how to protect their investment. How do you get the next round of funding? So the conversation is very, very different. So, and that helps corporate governance in a very, very different manner. So I think if you look at those two, and the third one is, if you're not at the core profitable and can't do that, it's a misnomer that you can be in the business for the next 10 years and 20 years.
Okay, fair enough. So, would steps maybe to retain client, aside from companies that are listed, be maybe ESOPs, that we need a little more friendly taxation on that front when it comes to the startup community, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I do believe that the ESOP tax structure right now can go through a bit of a change, because actually it's at the highest level of everything else.
Yeah.
It's a plus, plus, plus. And I think that is the future wealth creation, because if you've got a startup ecosystem that is going to be large and it's going to get listed, I think, yes, amongst anything else, including parity of capital gains, which a stock market would want in terms of short-term and long-term, and GST standardization, I think specifically when it comes to ESOP and wealth creation, putting it into a smaller bracket than this large bracket of first at exercising you need to take the tax and then again is right now a double whammy, absolutely can go through a relook.
What about, the fact that we can only attract capital from overseas right now via ADRs and GDRs? Do you think that something more on that front can be done as well?
So I think the private equity capital is that high risk capital, right? And the valuations that they've given, no normal person would do, frankly, whether we like it or not, because you got these 5, 6, 1 Japanese, 2 American, the East Coast of America funded a lot of founders here who then spent money on platforms and media companies like Google, Facebook, or IPL from the West Coast. So it was actually a circular approach to money. So if you look at that element there, Indian capital is not that trustworthy at these levels of valuation. And I think they'll be happy to do that. You're seeing Indian capital come in, but at very down-to-earth, grounded businesses, and not businesses which are flamboyant in nature and have a 10-year future horizon that may or may not happen.
Speaking of long-term time horizons as well, from the likes of Infosys, now we've moved to the gig economy, the Swiggis and the Zomatos of the world. Just wanted to understand in terms of job skilling, in terms of profitability, how have you viewed the transition that we've seen in?
I think we need to get going on that. I think right now, if you look at, I don't know whether you can call them gig economy or not, and I think companies like Swiggy and Zomato have done a good job, but then they've gone out and blown money on 10-minute delivery systems. Now, I think that's a fad.
Yeah.
It's a fad. But $1 billion later is not an accountability people can have, because your return on capital employment is screwed for life. It's just gone for life from that perspective. So I think that indulgent capital that said, let's try this, let's try that, and then the PR headline overtakes the ground reality is when damage happens. And the double happens that the 99 other great entrepreneurs and founders are actually corrupted or left high and dry because the 1 or 2 were the bad pennies in this.
MSMEs, that's an important cog in the manufacturing
Very
wheel.
important.
And when it comes to, job skilling and job creation over there, is there enough that's being done already, and what more?
I think it hasn't got the media recognition and therefore hasn't got the sexy and glamour approach to it. I've run a toothbrush manufacturing plant in my younger days. And we built it into a large factory. I can tell you, to get attention, to get even a bank loan for it was like you had to, this thing as compared to saying, I'm starting an app or I'm starting this or I got viewers, the 5 people crowding for you. So unfortunately, I would say the small and mid-scale industry actually needs that little bit of glamour. It needs evangelism, and the government actually can do a lot. It's as much as the Prime Minister standing on the pulpit and saying, "Startup India," and we wanted to be that. Suddenly, parents at home decided that my kid, who I would otherwise not let them be a startup, wow, it's now something good to do. So somewhere for that sector, we do need a boost. Not necessarily tax incentives, just positioning that these are the businesses of the future.
And you have always said that you're an optimist, and I want to understand how India's perception is at the moment when it comes to global investors viewing us.
We'll have a perception, and we should not overpitch. We should not over-dramatize that. I think our story is absolutely intact. We need to do it in a very respectful manner. Today, if you look at our foreign policy, it's 10 times better than the United States of America, which frankly has a wavering foreign policy at most times. If you look at that today, we've actually harnessed the West and Russia in a very, very diplomatic manner and come out in true colors. We've actually stood up and said, we'll do what is right for our country, which is a very strong policy matter. And I think people will start respecting that. And I think respect you get not necessarily by being the nice guy. Respect you get when you actually become yourself. That's when you really get respect. And I think for too long we tried to be the nice guy, and now we're not. And I think that's where we'll attract a lot more capital.
And I can't help but ask about education, of course, a sector very close to you. Where do you think, or how much more do you think needs to be done in order to make education a lot more affordable and easily accessible?
So, the word education is a sort of a calendared event. And I think it's because education, when you say that, is mostly people look at it as school and college. And I think that needs to be in the not-for-profit space when you're a school and college, because there's a limit to what you can do. But private sector, but the point is, if you want to attract teachers, if you want to attract faculty, and if you want to actually get your GRE ratios up, which we do want to get, the ability for us to be able to do that will be to open it up to the private sector. But the real education, which is the lifelong learning, comes when you start getting your job. How do you get yourself more job ready? How are you a more upskilled person? How are you a much more smarter person? That part has to be an absolute free economy, like the IT sector was allowed to thrive in the 1990s. If that can happen to two large sectors which excite me. One is obviously the lifelong learning sector, which you're calling education, but it is much more than that.
Sure.
And the second is the care sector, which is a broader word than even healthcare. And I say that because the world is getting older. People are going to require care. And we don't have even trained people. The jobs that we can do in just the care sector can be tens and millions of people, from nurses and doctors to many other elements of care, from psychiatric care to mental care to many others. That entire sector needs to be developed, and the training to make that happen, to me, just requires almost like a budget announcement that says if India can be owning some of these spaces, both as being a teaching capital of the world in some form and a care capital of the world, because actually our nurses go around the world. We have the empathy and the pathos inbuilt in our culture that can actually heal people around the world. So I think these two sectors need real canvassing, not just in a budget, but on an ongoing basis by the government.
And with the massive young population in India, any parting words of advice, wisdom that you would like to give, or job skills that you think are absolutely detrimental and necessary to survive?
Yeah, I think everyone should just go for it. I think we've got the ambition, and I think stop worrying about what anybody else thinks, and stop reading in the media about these 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 proclamations or idols, because actually they'll fall by the wayside. Somebody asked me today, we have 100 unicorns. I can guarantee only 25 will be there 3 years from now. Maybe another ones will come, and those in this time will be the more genuine ones. And I think that's one. And just overall for all of us as India, I know many times from 1995 we said this is our time, and then the tiger has arrived. Then we, many of those metaphors we've used. I really feel today, given what's happening in the globe, it is India's time, but just the narrative won't work. We have to all, and just the government alone can't do it. It's going to require a massive rally of people. Maybe not 1.4 billion, but at least 400 million.
All right, and on that positive note, we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Screwvala,
Lovely
for
talking
taking
to you.
time out.
Thank you.
Thank you.